Hello everyone, I'm Joanna from Portugal. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology and I'm going to be presenting a contribution with the title The Laugh Makers, How Language Shapes Stand-up Comedy and Ethnography. This contribution intends to discuss the influence of language in humor and research on humor through the example of an ethnography of the stand-up comedy nights, the amateur and semi-amateur circuit in Lisbon. The focus is on the way of doing and writing stand-up, the creative process, comedians' motivations, and I would just pass really quickly to some of the main authors who's been the base of the theoretical conceptualization for my research, because my main focus is then to provide some examples that connect with language. So I guess the main issue right now is still that there's still not a unified theory explaining humor, regardless of all the greatest thinkers who have reflected on humor, laughter, and comedy. In anthropology, mostly it's been focusing on the ritualized function of laughter and the comic in different dimensions, symbolism, cultural variation, or representation. If we look at the linguistic theories in general, the perspective that leans towards linguistic relativity seems to impact humor more, because if we accept that grammatical and semantic categories of a specific language provide a frame of reference for our perception and cognition, then humor is always a product of a specific language and requires a native level to be understood. But even considering universalism and the innate capacity for language, or even an innate universal grammar, it is the process of language acquisition and the subtleties and particularities of syntax, morphology, and semantics, who are specific to an idiom, where humor operates. The linguistic written jokes are often complex plays on words and meanings that rely on figure of speeches, double entendres, irony, sarcasm, metaphors, or idiomatic expressions. To laugh at a joke requires the cognitive interpretation of linguistic, cultural, and comic codes, and it's an interpretation that is often so quick that the laughter itself is perceived as involuntary, physiological, and not rational. The verbal expression and reception of jokes also relies on phonology, prosody, and pragmatic use of language that may be more easily understood by native level speakers. And there is even another important layer of comprehension, especially when we think about humor in a performative context, such as stand-up comedy format, that is the unspoken, the language that is actually not there explicitly, as the shared naturalizations and contextual references, the different contextual meanings of body language and expression, even some linguistic economy that is required for jokes that work in a way that often the joke is not in what it is said, but in the innuendos or the omissions, in what the chosen language implies. In addition, there's also individual subjectivity, context and content itself that complexifies the practice of receiving and observing humor and its subsequent ethnographic description. Laughter is relational, and so is research in anthropology. So at this regard, I think that the language of the comedian may influence the way an audience receives and reacts to a joke, and the researcher sometimes excludes themselves in the process of scientific production as a member of the audience, but that's what we are. our emotionality and our corporality also inhabits the field. Um, so I've started to notice that sometimes my laughter was similar to the comedian's laughter, and it was also um, connected with how well I connected the comedians who were performing and how much I like them both as comedians and personally. That meant that was something that happened because I knew their text and their style a bit better, but that happened also when they were testing material or when in comparison with other people that I knew the material as well. And the comedians, they also know each other very well. So they usually laugh at different moments. They laugh for anticipation, they laugh when they identify the beginning of a bit that they like, of surprise when their peers make a mistake or react in an unexpected way, or even when they're bombing. And I've also observed another different laughter, which was that of the audience members that personally know the comedian as friends, partners, family, and that usually react more in a disproportionate way, like louder, laugh more. They laugh more often at the jokes of the person they know than of other comedians. And I would just like to leave for reflection if that is not an indication that maybe the requirement of insensibility to laugh, as Bergson talks about, it's not always true, because I believe these are laughters that come from the affection towards the comedian. But I also wonder if they can have a connection with language. If by knowing the joke maker, maybe we could better understand the angle of their humor and the subtleties that maybe do not connect with the broader language, but with their individual expression, and go behind the joke itself and perceive the way that what they are doing expresses who they are. I can give an example of this connection with an broader audience in Portugal, which is a comedian called Pedro Teixeira da Mota, which is one of the most famous Portuguese stand-up comedians and has a very long-lasting podcast. And he has a very close, specific use of language where he appropriates words to mean something completely different. And it's a bit surprising for me how that is understood completely by and immediately by his fans and his audience, but people don't know him. Myself, when I started listening to him, it took a while for me to understand what was being talked about, because it's almost a code that unifies his fans as an exclusive group, and even if a large one. I believe that an element of the comedian's laughter is also the fact that they communicate in a way that it's almost a dialect or technical jargon with terms, concepts, expressions that they use to talk about their work that are naturalized but not necessarily part of everyone's vocabulary. And I knew it was important to learn this jargon, and also that it was important to try stand-up comedy, because I was listening to a lot of podcasts and interviews, and there is always this reference to a physiological experience that they couldn't really describe through words. And I thought that was the way of knowing what they were talking about and be able to research better this subject. So was that immersion on the field and participation that allowed me to understand the jargon. But what also happened was that speaking in those terms made the comedians more receptive to my presence, and I got an acceptance in conversations that I don't think I would had got if that hadn't been my approach to the field. I got some street cred, if you will, and but it's also interesting to think about on the other way around, because the reality is, I mean, they don't really feel that they need to adapt those terms when they speak to a wider audience, when they are in podcasts or interviews. And I think that has something to do with this knowing that there's a consumption of international and specials, podcasts, and comedians interviews, and that's so somehow those terms are part of the public discourse and would, if not understood, at least won't be completely strange terms for most people. I think in Portugal that's even more interesting because majority of the terms that are used are not even translated into Portuguese. They became what is called an estrangeirismo, which is a word that has a translation in Portuguese, but it's used in the original language. Some examples are bit, acting, bombing. It's an interesting one because they use bombing, but then they also use bombar, which is like a semi-translation with the verb in English to bomb, but the termination in Portuguese, ar, bombar. And then there's an example that is different and that I think there's something to it, which is the to kill or die on stage, which in the Portuguese comedians would use if they are talking about some international performers, but were not used if they are talking among themselves about themselves or their colleagues. Instead of killing the audience, they use the expression partir a casa, which means to break the room. And usually, if it's not going well, they would just say they bombed. They won't use the expression die. This brings attention also to another problem, which is of what is lost in translation. If we think about the example of this conference itself, my communication would have been very different if this was conference in Portuguese for a Portuguese audience, because I would be able to focus more on language and cultural examples, but I would need to waste too much time to translate those into an understandable reference for an English-speaking audience. So humor and comedy, they may be universal, but when they are rooted in language, we may receive it differently depending on our understanding of the language of delivery. And an example of this, I have tried to watch stand-up comedy specials in English in different ways, just with the English audio, with the English audio and subtitles, with English audio and Portuguese subtitles. And I think they become different products in those ways. For example, if you have the subtitles in Portuguese, it almost becomes a dissonant experience because the jokes being told in the subtitles are not always exactly the same ones that the comedian is saying in English, because the translation requires to also translate references to find equivalent idiomatic expressions. There are some double meanings that are lost, and other subtleties that are the fabric that makes the joke that are lost. Then just the fact that we are reading in subtitles, it also affects reception, because sometimes you are reading the punchline before you hear it, and so the rhythm is off. An example of this from my field is that in Lisbon there are some English-speaking shows, and I didn't know they existed when I started, but then I thought it would be interesting to try to make some little comparison between the Portuguese-speaking and English-speaking, And I started following that, especially because there was Portuguese comedians who would also perform in these places. And what I've observed is that usually in that comparison with the Portuguese comedians killed mostly were the ones who had either less reference jokes, or reference dependent jokes, or the ones who had jokes that had a referencing of difference of what sets them apart, but that in this context usually was self-deprecation towards the Portuguese. So what set them apart from the audience was actually a reference that was common to the audience, because it was an international audience, but mostly of people who lived or were visiting Lisbon. I just would like to end this question of translation with how the format itself of modern stand-up comedy was kind of created through language as a phenomena, and that also set the boundaries of what it means for something to be stand-up. And it was something that traveled from the United States to the rest of the world without really being contested. It was just accepted as a format. In Portugal, the first stand-up comedy shows were all in the 90s, and there is a dispute that is very interesting in this sense, because the North was the zone where those first nights appeared, but the comedians from Lisbon always mention that they also did anecdotes and musical comedies, so they weren't real stand-up comedians. Even though what they were doing was something that was very Portuguese and part of the tradition. So stand-up was an imported format, but it was perceived as something more legitimate, something that was what all Portuguese comedians should aspire to do. So defining what stand-up comedy was meant as well a judgment of what comedy in its most valuable form should be. In conclusion, right now I am a bit lost in questioning as well, so I just tried to leave some examples of how language is being materialized in my research. And I would like to just leave two open questions. If can use of language in humor indicate cultural or taste variations? And does it signal variations on social practices and discourse? And I would just also like to conclude by saying that the site of knowledge production is also one where language that describes a phenomena creates and conceptualizes that phenomena. So we as researchers must be careful as well, neither to replicate without questioning the narratives and the language of the comedians, neither to translate them to a strictly academic jargon that loses all touch with the reality we observe and read. Any doubt, you can send me an email. I leave my contacts here, and thank you again. Bye bye.